In this video, I'm going to share with you the top 3 grading companies, and if you stay to the end, I'm going to share with you a bonus grading company that I promise that you're not thinking of, and it's going to blow your mind, but let's get into it. Number three here is going to be SGC, okay? SGC has its pros and its cons. So the pro about SGC, the biggest pro, I would say, is the turnaround time, okay? So the turnaround time, all right? This means that they're actually reliable when you send your cards to them. They'll get your cards back in like a week. It's pretty crazy as opposed to other grading companies where their turnaround time is simply just terrible to be straightforward. So the turnaround time is good, and honestly, the margins are almost there with PSA. So the way it goes with SGC, so the way the grades work, for example, right, you have a 10 and a 9.5. So an SGC 10 here, this is almost worth what a PSA 10 is worth usually, except in my experience, it's actually a little bit harder to get an SGC 10 than it is a PSA 10. However, you get your cards back much faster, and it almost sells for a PSA 10. So like an SGC 10, this is equivalent to a PSA 10. It's worth a little bit less. And an SGC 9.5, this is kind of equivalent to a PSA 9 in terms of value. Obviously, per card, this is going to change a little bit. But those are some pros. The money is there with SGC, except it's a little bit harder to get that 10. When you're sending cards to SGC, you're aiming for that 10. If it gets an SGC 9.5, you're probably going to break even, maybe lose a little bit of money or make a little bit of money. So the goal is to get the SGC 10, except it's a little bit harder than a PSA 10, and it sells for a little bit less, okay? So those are some of the pros with SGC. And some of the cons with SGC, so pros is it almost sells for what a PSA 10 is. Some of the cons is, so cons here. So number one, I don't know how much this matters to people, but I guess it's a thing, is the eye appeal. So honestly, SGC cards, like if we just look here, like honestly, they're kind of ugly, to be frank with you. Like SGC 10, if we just look at a random card, like this is, I mean, they could do better. This is just not a good-looking case, to be honest with you. But that is a con if you consider it a con. And also liquidity. So, like, this is, like, the main con. So, like, liquidity. So, like, for example, the reason why this is a problem. So, if you buy a card, let's say for $100, and it gets an SGC 10, and let's say it's worth $300 according to eBay, you're going to have a little bit more difficult of a time selling it than, let's say, PSA, just simply because of the liquidity. A collector, so when you buy a card, for example, and let's just break this down, right? So like if you, right, number one, all right, you buy a card, all right, and then number two, you send it in for grading, and number three, now, thankfully, hopefully this card is an SGC 10, and let's say this is a card of Wemby, all right, Victor Wembanyama. Well, when you go and sell this card, usually who are you selling that card to? Well, you're selling it to a collector, right? The person that's buying this card of Victor Wembanyama is usually someone that has the mindset of, oh, okay, I want to buy Victor Wembanyama and hold these cards for the long term, or I think he's going to be a good player, or I'm going to store these cards just in my safe. And a lot of people don't like modern cards with SGC. Now, going back to here, one of the pros with SGC I probably should mention is vintage. So like it is like the top company for vintage, this and PSA. So vintage is a pro, but I'm not really talking about vintage cards here. I'm more talking about modern. But so you're gonna, and the reason why this is a problem, so like you're gonna have to sell it for a little bit less than you might like sometimes, just because it's a little bit less liquid, right? The less demand you have for a card, the price is gonna drop. So if this card's worth $300 that you got back from SGC, and you're not getting as many offers as you like, you're gonna have to drop that price and drop that price, which is why liquidity directly affects how much you could sell a card for, right? So hopefully that makes sense. That's number 3, SGC, and number 2, the number 2 grading company that I actually have made a lot of money with, probably the most amount of money, is Beckett, okay? Now, let me give you the quick little story about Beckett. So when I got into sports cards from 2015 to about 2020, Beckett was actually the company. It was the number one company for modern cards, and you really didn't send your cards anywhere else, and they were amazing. They got your cards back super fast. They were a little bit inconsistent, and once the pandemic started, Nat Turner bought PSA, and PSA started to overrun Beckett. Beckett was taking too long to get their cards back, and they were doing all sorts of things that people didn't like. So over time, a Beckett 9.5 and a PSA 10 used to be even, but Beckett just fell off, which is why a Beckett 9.5 is not worth what it once was. But Beckett still has some merits to it still, and let me just explain here. So some pros of Beckett, all right? Some pros of Beckett that people like. They have something called subgrades, okay? So what subgrades are, if we hop over to eBay real quick, if you guys don't know, and I don't know why other grading companies don't do this. So if we look at Beckett 9.5, so we just pull up a random card of like Quentin Johnson. You could see at the top there, right, it has subgrades. So it has the big grade, which is a 9.5, and then it has subgrades, like the centering, the edges, the corners, and the surface. So people like that, and I think Beckett has great appeal too. So like, in my opinion, I think Beckett has the best eye appeal. They just have the best looking case. And so those are some pros. And also, this could be a pro or a con the way you look at it. I think it's a pro, actually. So inconsistency. Hopefully I'm spelling that right. So the inconsistency, a card that you might maybe won't want to send to SGC or PSA because you don't think it'll get that grade you want. Beckett may give it that 9.5. Beckett's always been a little bit inconsistent, and I should say they're a little bit more lenient, okay? Because, right, when you send a card to SGC, you're aiming for that 10, okay? You're aiming for an SGC 10. That's where you make money. But with Beckett, you're actually aiming for a 9.5. This is where you make money, okay, with a Beckett 9.5. And it's just a little bit easier to get that Beckett 9.5 than it is to get an SGC 10 or a PSA 10, in my experience. And honestly, they're a little bit more inconsistent. Like, I've gotten some cards back from Beckett that probably should not have got a 9.5, but they did, which to me is a pro. And also, Beckett has this thing called a Beckett 10, okay? Beckett 10. And why is this important? So a Beckett 10 usually outsells a PSA 10 or an SGC 10. But this is rare, okay? When you send a card to Beckett, you can't really expect a Beckett 10. But it adds this extra layer that, oh, if I get a Beckett 10, my cards can sell for a lot of money. And also, they have something called a black label, okay? Let me explain. So, right, we have, these are the 4 subgrades with Beckett, right? You have corners, you have edges, you have centering, and then we have surface, right? So the way this works, if your card, let's say, has 9.5 corners, 9.5 edges, 9.5 centering, let's say 9 surface. This card is going to grade a 9.5, okay? And then if any of these, like if this, or if this, or if this, if one of these were a 9, then this grade would drop down to a 9.5, okay? But to get a 9.5, you need at least 3 9.5s and 1 9. That's the minimum. All 9.5s across the board, you're still going to get a 9.5. And then 1 10 and 3 9.5s, still a 9.5. 2 10s, 2 9.5s, still a 9.5. But once you get to the next level, and let's say this was a 10, this was a 10, centering was a 10, and a surface was a 9.5, this would actually equate to a 10, okay? And this is where you could make some serious money. Once again, only a few % of cards get that Beckett 10, so I wouldn't expect it. But Beckett has this extra grade that these other companies don't have that's very lucrative. And then also on top of this, what you could do, and this is very rare, if this card gets all 10s, this is what's called a black label, okay? And I probably should have put that in black, but that's called a black label. Let me just show you what this looks like. So, like, once again, this is very rare, so like don't expect it to happen to you. And honestly, I've never gotten a black label before. But if your card gets a black label like this, for example, if it's black, that means all the subgrades are a 10 like you see here, and these cards will sell for, I mean, what anyone's willing to pay, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50x of what you paid. So that Beckett does have that extra layer, which is pretty cool. But the downside of Beckett, so if we go into some cons here, I have it written down over here. So it is kind of slow. Beckett they're very inconsistent with their turnaround times. They'll tell you 5 days and it'll take 2 weeks. And it didn't used to be like that, but recently it's been like that. And also, so once again, this to me is a pro. Over here, the inconsistency, but some might see it as a con. But it is a little bit inconsistent. So you might send a card that looks really good, and it's going to get a 9.5, and it doesn't. So that is kind of a downside. I think it's a good, but also, it is what it is. And also it's declining in popularity. So just over time, Beckett is just going down, down, down. And those are really the cons. And what I would say, because of this inconsistency, the way I use Beckett, so because it's inconsistent, I love to send higher end cards that may not be in the best condition to Beckett. And another con is the margins. Okay. So, you're aiming, if we're sending cards to SGC, we're aiming for that 10. You're usually going to over double your money, usually, for buying the right cards. Beckett, with a 9.5, that's never really going to happen. You're going to make like 1.5, 1.6 times in your money. So Beckett doesn't have the same margins it used to, but with this whole Beckett 10 thing, you could make some serious money because Beckett 10s do sell really, really well, usually. So that is the second company, Mr. Beckett. And number one, I mean, you guys could probably guess this, is PSA. So PSA is the number one grading company. It's just, it is what it is. So like the pros, the margins are good. For the most part, they are consistent. Also, they are the most liquid. So like when you go and sell a card, like this example I gave up here, and you're selling a card to a collector, PSA is preferred. So because these cards are more liquid, you can sell them for closer to top dollar. Okay, so like PSA for the most part is just the best. And then some cons of PSA is turnaround times. But what I would say about turnaround times, so they are kind of inconsistent with turnaround times, and that does take a little bit long because they have so many cards going to them. What I would say about that is it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because if you're being consistent and sending in 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards a week in a month or 2 months, whatever it might be, you won't even notice the turnaround times are taking longer because you're just having cards coming back to you every week. So like you need a little bit more money for doing it correctly, to be able to spend money on cards and not get them back. But once you get in the process of rolling, the cards are just coming back to you every week. So turnaround times don't matter as much as you might think if you're consistently sending in cards, because after a certain period of time, you're not even going to recognize it. And also what I would say is another con that it's like a kind of a weird one, but I have seen them damage cards. I haven't seen this from other companies, honestly. I'm sure they've done it, but I've actually gotten my cards damaged by PSA, and they make it right, but it's kind of a pain in the ass to get in touch with them and stuff. But PSA does send in so many cards. People get so many cards. I have seen them damage cards. I have seen them lose cards. I've had this happen to me multiple times. But they do make it right. Right, PSA does have insurance when you send in cards. So that is the number one company. And what I would say, so like you're probably asking yourself, well, PSA is the number one company. Why would I not just send all my cards to PSA? So the way I do it, so let me break this down. So, we have 1, PSA, we have 2, Beckett, then we have number 3, SGC. So the way I do it is most of my cards go here. So this is like most of my cards are going to PSA. The way I use Beckett is, me personally, I send them higher end cards that are in so condition. Okay? So, like, for example, last year I sent a big Otani card that I didn't think would get a PSA 10, but I got a Beckett 9.5. So I use Beckett the least, to be honest. And then SGC, the way you should use SGC is if your budget is smaller, okay? And why? Because if you only have, let's say, $500 to work with, well, then SGC, even though an SGC 10 is going to sell for a little bit less than a PSA 10, you get it back in a week, as opposed to PSA is going to take 30, 45, 60 days. So that turnaround time, if you have $500 and you buy 5 cards for $100 each, now you're shit out of luck and you just have to wait for PSA to get these cards back. You actually make more money by you getting these cards back quicker, even though you're going to make 10 to 20% less money. Or there's something called opportunity cost. The money is more valuable to you today than it is in the future. And that's what I would say. That's how me personally, I use the companies. Now I'm fortunate my budget isn't small, so I don't really send cards to SGC. So PSA is getting most of my cards. Beckett here and there if I have like a weird higher end card that I don't think will grade a PSA 10. But now, let me leave a little bonus for you. Okay? So a little bonus section. And so some of you guys might be saying, well, there's all these other grading companies, right? There's all these other grading companies, like some of you guys may not even heard of them, like HGA, and then like Arena Club. And honestly, I don't use any of these companies. And then CGC, right? So there's all these other grading companies. And what happened is during the pandemic, people saw how lucrative sports cards is, and all these other grading companies tried to get traction. Now, they all failed, at least in my opinion. I don't know how any of these companies are profitable, to be honest with you. But maybe they are, maybe they're not. But what you could do with these other grading companies, and what I've done in the past, is this. So check this out. So if we look here, and I was actually looking at this before, which is why I know. So check this out. So if we look at an HGA 9.5 Hertz Contenders, okay. Now, if we go to recently sold items, I know this because I was researching it before this video. So check this out, right? This card is graded by HGA, all right? And it's graded a 9.5. And I need to take a better look at this card, but it looks like it's in solid condition. So check this out. If we have an HGA 9.5 of Hertz, and this card sells for, I believe it was $463, right? Now, what's cool about this? Even though these companies aren't as reputable, HGA actually uses like a robot or something or AI to grade their cards. But even though these companies aren't as reputable, it's graded at 9.5. It's in decent condition. Now, the corners and surface here kind of have me a little bit worried. But you can assume this card is in good condition, right? It's not fucked up. Now, if you look here at this same card of Jalen Hurts, and you look at his 2020 Contenders Hurts PSA 10, and we go down here. Check this out. So if we find the same card, which is right here, the same card graded a PSA 10 sells for $13.50, right? So a PSA 10 of this card equals $13.50. Now, this is a more of an advanced strategy. What I've done in the past, and I've made a lot of money doing it, is I will buy this card, an HGA 9.5 of Hertz. I'll crack it out of the case, knowing it's in good condition, and I'll send it into PSA and try to get that PSA 10 and sell it for $13.50. So you can actually take advantage of these lower-end grading companies. And there's a bunch more. I don't know all of them off the top of my head. Because they're not as reputable, they auction for much less. You can buy them. You know they're in good condition for the most part, because the companies, even though they're not reputable to others, for the most part, they're reputable in terms of, right, they're not just going to give a card that's in shitty condition a 9.5, right, because then that would diminish their whole brand. And you can take advantage that most people don't even know what like an HGA 9.5 is. No one wants it. Collectors don't want it. Sells for much less. Crack it out. Send it to PSA. I actually did this when these companies were really starting in 2021. I bought a Red Zone. So it was a 2020 Contenders Red Zone. Justin Herbert graded a HGA 9.5. It had all 9.5 subgrades. And I cracked it out. I paid $5,000 for it. Cracked it out. Sent it to PSA. And at the time, Justin Herbert was like worth way more than he is now. Got it graded. Sold it at the National Card Show. It graded a PSA 10. Sold it at the National Card Show for $12,000. Bought it for 5, knew it was in good condition, got a PSA 10, sold it for 12 grand, which is pretty cool. But that's a little bonus section for you guys. Honestly, I would stick with just sending cards to PSA. Honestly, this is like the simplest way to make money. And if you're a little bit more broke and your budget's like $500 or $1,000 and you really want to get into cards, SGC is your answer. But honestly, if you're broke, I wouldn't get into cards. I would just work and save money, save up a few $1,000s. But hopefully you like this video and you like the new setup behind me. If you're watching this on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.